All right, this is Brad from EastCoastAngel, and today we're going to tear down an IR3. This is a full series that we're doing, and we're going from each platform. Full teardown, all internals being removed, board, regulator internals, breech pins, everything gets taken out of these guns other than the set screws for the air passages. All right, let's get right to it. All right, so typically I have a nice little assortment of tools that I use. I've been using Eclipse grease for years. I like it. It's readily available everywhere you go to buy paintball stuff. If you don't have tools, meaning, angel tools, these can be found pretty much anywhere. Paintball Nation, M. Carter Brown. You can go on Facebook. The angel groups have people that have stuff like this in stock. This is for pulling out the LPR piston, and you can add shims and or take shims out. This is for the ram. It's got two prongs. It goes in the back. You unscrew it, and then you can pull the ram out, or you can adjust it in if you find that you need to do any sort of fine tuning. These are definitely a plus to have. I would recommend picking up tools that are angel specific. That way you don't run into any issues. The Angel Toolkit, really handy. It's got all of the necessary sizes. In fact, I use this primarily just because they have a decent, metal that they use, believe it or not, and they fit better, than other ones that I've used before. They don't round as easily. And honestly, I think I've had this kit for a couple of years now, and I've never run into an issue. Now, granted, this little guy is kind of bent out of shape, but I'm not too worried. We're not going to be using him today. I have a pair of jeweler's pliers. That is for the snap ring that's in the Reg. I'd recommend getting a pair or getting a pair of circlip pliers. You can get those at any hardware store, mainly because of the fact that circlip that's in the regulator, there's really only one way to take it out. And I mean, if you try forcing it, you might break it. They're not easy to find, at least that particular size. So again, use the proper tools, and I think you'll find that, everything, will go a little bit smoother. I use a Leatherman primarily for tapping out the Reg internals. Essentially, it's just a nice hard flat surface. Never had an issue with it. I sometimes will use this as leverage for there's a bolt that takes and it runs from the vertical ASA to the body. Usually you have to put a shorter Allen key in there. If you have T-handles, awesome. If you don't, you're going to need a little bit of leverage at some point, in which I recommend using that. This, and I just usually, and then off she comes. I always recommend people use a pick of some sort for the O-rings, and also just to, you can kind of get into places and get, grime and grit out of there a little bit easier. They make these all different types. You can buy them at Tractor Supply or Harbor Freight Tools. Super cheap, really easy, and they just save you a little bit of time in the long run. And of course I have my trusted wooden spoon, in which I always use it to push out the internals because it doesn't damage, it doesn't scratch. If you put a gouge inside the internal tube here, an O-ring is going to have a hard time sealing that up. It only likes a good smooth surface. You put a gouge or a scratch, I've seen people use screwdrivers and stuff and gouge these and make them really difficult to seal up. Again, a dowel or for me a wooden spoon works awesome. Now we are going to get right to it. This gun hasn't been torn apart, and in fact the guy that sent it in has just told me that it has been sitting for about 10 years. I did put the charger to it, and as you can see, the board's not lighting up. But the one that interesting thing, for 10 years old, the battery still semi works, which is amazing. But again, I've seen batteries that have, lasted up until now without any issue, and I've seen batteries that, have been dead for years. So it's kind of like a gamble, in that regard. So right now what I'm doing is I'm just taking off anything that's non-essential, volumizers. There's no real reason to keep those attached to the gun. Take the reg off because I'm going to do the reg teardown first. I'm going to essentially show you the easiest way to do it. And here we go. Again, using jeweler's pliers or circlip pliers allow you to get this little guy out. Be careful when taking these out and make sure that your area is kind of contained, clean. That's one thing I really like to stress. These things, if they happen to fly away from you, will be almost impossible to find. I mean, I've lost them when they've actually fallen right here before because they blend in with certain colors and whatnot, and so I've been like, oh, I know it was right here. But yeah, so again, keep an eye on these because they will fly. They are spring loaded. They will take off on you. And now we've gotten to that point where, like I said, I use my Leatherman tool and I just tap the the top of the reg. And as you can see, that piston came right out. It's greased right up. That's always a good sign. Essentially, what it's telling me is that unlike the LED that I did a while ago, that sat for quite some time, all of the grease had disappeared, and in its place was a bunch of varnish, which is typical, especially with older Angels that sit. You're going to find that, the grease doesn't last forever. All of the O-rings and stuff like that should be replaced, on markers that have been sitting, unless, of course, they seal up. See, sometimes people will take, and they'll replace every single O-ring. Typically, I do. The one thing I like to kind of see and check out is with the mini reg, I like to see how the O-rings fit in it without taking them out and swapping them out. Sometimes I will, go ahead and drop that down in there and, see what kind of, resistance it gives me. That actually, it's got some resistance to it. Still, I can put a little bit of grease on that. I won't swap the O-ring out on that. The tip is looking good. It's it's bumped up like it should. It's not flattened. It's not missing, which is awesome. The rest of this is in good shape. So that's one thing that probably won't get touched or have to worry about. If you're missing the tip on this, you're going to notice that your velocity is going to be very hard to control. In that case, you're going to want to look for a new one. Again, when you're tearing these down, if you happen to notice that. And, again, the resistance on this, piston is good, and I like that, so I'm probably going to grease these up. Now these O-rings will last forever. They're still soft. The grease is probably helping them continue to do their job. The one thing I do like to do is I like to take this O-ring off and swap that out. It's a very standard O-ring, pretty basic stuff right there. Just showed you how the reg gets torn down. The one thing that I do like to do also, I like to back this little guy out and see if the threads are good. If I'm backing it out, if it's kind of notchy or kind of gritty, I definitely will, at that point, pay a little bit more attention, clean those threads, put a little bit of grease in the threads. When I'm putting it back in, boom, don't have to worry about that. You know, I use a lot of Q-tips when I'm cleaning these guns because I find that they work really well. But the one thing that they do is they do leave kind of like a little bit of, you know, fibers. Nothing that can't be taken care of, but I mean, you can see they, you know, they get in there, they do their job, they get all of the grit that you know, can't sometimes see, you know, and like I said, if you're using them and whatnot, just make sure that you know, they don't leave anything behind. You can always, you know, just compressed air, you can blow on them most of the time, and they will, you know, all the little fuzzies will make their way out. Another thing is the fittings. You know, I like to make sure that they, you know, that they're working properly, that they seal up properly. This one did. I put a bit of macro in it, and you know, it held onto it really well, and then I was able to, you know, pop it right back out. So there's your Reg rebuild, or teardown actually, and now we're going to get to the main body. And at this point, I like to open up the grips. I like to get, you know, the wires unplugged for all of the components that are inside. I find that, you know, if you do that, you have less chance of damaging stuff. You know, some of these wires are starting to get some age on them, and which they become brittle. I always tell people when taking these guns apart, be careful, just because even the most simplest task, you know, can turn into, you know, something breaking. And when I open this up, the very first thing I see electrical tape on one of the connectors, which tells me at some point somebody probably wasn't, you know, really gentle with this, and then they probably soldered them, you know, or you know, or just put them back together and then wrap the tape around them so they wouldn't touch each other. So now we're at this point, we're unplugged everything. That's always good. You know, I don't have to remove the board, but I will, just for the sake of this full, you know, teardown video. This one, the IR3 has the COPS, you know, or Sensi, in which it's a pad that's located in the frame. There's a hole in the breech right below the feed neck. The ball is dropped down. They hit a little pin. The pin in you know, in succession hits the little pad. There's a sensor, and it tells the board that there's a ball. It allows the gun to shoot faster because it is essentially a anti-chop device. Now, when working properly and all together, it's amazing. And I've seen them work phenomenally well. The problem is, these are old. Everything's old. Paint gets down into that little tiny area where that where the COPS rod is, and it sits down on, the paint will sit down on top of the Sensi unit, and it will rust it out, or make it so it doesn't work anymore. And at that point, people will just abandon it altogether and not use it. Not to say that these guns aren't fast without it, but it's kind of cool to have it all operational. So anyway, we've got everything unplugged. We're gonna go ahead and remove the board. There's 2 screws, top and bottom. And of course, these always tend to just kind of hang up on everything. I've never had one just pop right out like it should. It always has to get stuck on something, in which you just kind of have to finagle it around a little bit. There's no, you know, right way or wrong way. You know, typically the board will come out at some point. Now, the reason I'm going to point this out is there's a lip on the board here, and these buttons right here, so the board actually fits kind of underneath it, so they will hit right there. So you just have to kind of wiggle it around a little bit, and then you can get it to free up. At this point, you can push the buttons right out, And I would recommend cleaning them up, because all kinds of stuff will get down in there. They'll make the buttons stick. They could activate or shut off the firing mode to the board, to the board if it's stuck in. At that point, it could just kind of like make you, frustrated while you're out there trying to play, and your gun keeps shutting off. And you're not sure why. Essentially, the name of the game is to keep the gun as clean as possible, and that works, to everybody's favor. And of course, we have screws that aren't going to want to come out. It's very common with these guns where people torque the screws right down. Essentially, if your screws on your frame are tight, keeps the frame on there and they're not loose and it's not wobbling around, it's doing its job. There's really no reason to have to torque them right down. In fact, when you do that, you end up stripping out the screws, and you make it harder, for further or future maintenance. Especially if you send your gun in and you have somebody else work on them. I can tell you firsthand, when somebody sends a gun in, if they do not disclose that the screws are stripped, or that they've already tried to access the gun and they've tried to work on it themselves, and they haven't been able to, they haven't been successful, because they've stripped screws or whatnot. At that point, we tend to charge more to work on them. Right now, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to locate another Allen key that will work to get this one out, because it is starting to get to that point where it's not going to be easy to get out. And like I said, again, this is all stuff that can be prevented. This isn't stuff that happens by itself. It's always user error, and it's always somebody that thinks that they're that the screws need to be torqued right down, because their frame's going to fly off their gun, and who knows what'll happen then. And these guns are so hardy, and they're so well built, that trust me, it's not going to be like a Planet Eclipse Ego, where the frame's going to fold up on you if you happen to fall down. In fact, I've fallen before with these guns and gotten right back up and not a scratch on them. That's how amazing they are. Again, this screw is trash, so it's going to get thrown right away. I'm not even going to put it off to the side. I'm going to put it right in my trash bin. I don't want to see it again. And we got lucky with that one. If you noticed, about halfway through, I put my Allen key in and I tapped it on the top. Sometimes that works just like if you happen to have a air impact gun, and you notice that when you go to take something off of a car, it's got a loud hammering sound. It's because sometimes when you tap on stuff as you're trying to work it loose, it just makes it that much easier. It allows for it to that part to be removed. That is exactly what happened there, and we got lucky. I say that because it's not necessarily somebody did it on purpose, but the fact is sometimes you get lucky, the screws come out, you don't have to take out any other further tools. I've had to drill out screws before. I've had to inquire with a machinist for screws also that I haven't been able to get. Again, it's always an adventure. So we're gonna probably end up contacting the owner and seeing if he wants to swap out and put a decent pair of grips on these. These things are pretty beat, and they're starting to get that tackiness to them. The plug that was on the back that plugs the frame charging port actually was completely jelly. It was pretty gross. So we took that out. Now we have, essentially we're down to the bare bones of this. The cops or Sensi pad is right here. And like I said, that rod usually falls down and activates this, and it sends a signal right to the board, says you can go ahead and shoot faster. I'm going to guess that this one's probably beat. I haven't had the opportunity to hook it up yet and see myself, but it doesn't look like it's in good shape. So there's a set screw on the side of the frame. There's always going to be one unless someone didn't put it back. Again, I've seen guns before that have come in that have been missing a whole bunch of screws, and you can tell somebody at one point tried working on their gun and then, kind of bailed out on it. Again, there is absolutely no shame in having somebody else work on your marker for you if you feel like you've gotten in over your head. It's happened before. I've gotten, markers in boxes, where they literally are just bags of parts. Again, no shame in that at all. That's what we're here for. And then you tap out the pin. If while you are following me, the set screw's here, that means the pin goes the same way that the set screw is on the side of the frame. Pops right out. They don't always come out that easily, and if you need to, you can always use a punch. I always keep this one around for me. You can see it's actually bent a little bit. That was from some really rugged trigger pins, but it's nice to have an option again when you're working on these guns. So there's that. Gonna go ahead and leave that in there. I'll contact the owner and see if he wants to, get this back to original, or if he, wants me to leave it in. Right now, it's not doing any harm, just sitting. When I do go to clean up the frame and everything like that, I'll remove it, but then I can put it right back in. It's not that difficult to do. Now we're at that point where, we're gonna start looking at removing the body pins that hold the valve in and the LPR. The LPR pin is underneath the vertical ASA, but you can pull out the valve pin right there, and then you can go ahead and, like I said before, sometimes you're going to need a longer Allen key, and then a little bit of leverage. This one was actually loose, which is interesting, because so far most of the other screws have been pretty well torqued right on. So you go ahead and you just remove this. And it should just pretty much just fall out. Of course not. If it doesn't, it's no big deal. It can stay in there until the other part comes off. So we're going to go ahead and move on to the next screw, which is right here. It's the base plate or the manifold for the vertical ASA. One thing I noticed is that Angel always over-engineered everything. Essentially, they could have made this one piece if they wanted to, but they didn't. There were some aftermarket companies that did make one-piece vertical ASAs, which are kind of nice. It just cuts down on possible leaks, O-rings that have gone bad or dried out. You can see this one gets pretty chewed up, from the screw that goes through it. Essentially, that one will be replaced also. The one thing I always recommend, if you have bad screws, you have screws that you believe are questionable, always just replace them. You can typically go on to angelpaintballparts.com. It's run by George, and he's a really good guy. He's got O-ring kits, he's got screw kits, he's got parts, he's got a little bit of everything. And I would recommend going there if you need something to be able to get your Angel up and running. I'm pretty sure he'll have it. And so far, I mean, everything's been coming out pretty well. You can see this has got some rust on it. I've got a whole bunch of these, so I'll be replacing that. You know, sometimes there's a point where you can actually you know, you can clean these up, you can wire wheel them, and you can, you know, whatnot. But I mean, if rust is starting to set in, this is just a very mild steel. It's going to come back. And so, you know, if you have the option, swap it out, get rid of it, get something new in there, and then, you know, away you go. And I know that we were talking about this earlier. I had mentioned, you know, that you know, there's a rod that passes from the top of the, you know, right in this general area and the breech area that runs all the way through and then taps onto the pad that's in the frame. And I told you that all kinds of stuff can get down in there. You can see this has got all kinds of paint in there. So, you know, this isn't going to work well. You know, if it's not cleaned up and it doesn't, you know, and if it's got any sort of abrasion, it can hang up inside that one spot. There isn't a whole lot of room where that rod goes. So you can see, I mean, it tapers and it gets really thin. So, I mean, you know, you can see that there's no way that was working properly. You know, because the you know, that rod should move, you know, without any restriction. If it's going to use a paintball to tap on it, it should move pretty easy, and it didn't. Now, I pulled this you know, block out of the body. It's got two O-rings, one that goes around the outside and then another one that goes right in the middle. You're going to want to you know, look at those. If they're in good shape, typically they are. Honestly, these are O-rings that almost never go bad, which is a plus. Most of the time, it's because people don't remove them. You know, I've seen guns where literally this part has been like the very last thing that anyone's ever touched, you know, or has never been, you know, removed. So honestly, the O-rings on that are probably in great shape. But I mean, I'm going to be swapping them all out just because that's, you know, what I do. I'm kind of particular about that, you know, with certain ones. Of course, there are exceptions, like I said, with the regs and stuff like that. If the O-rings fit and they feel like they're, you know, going to be, you know, perfectly fine, then I will, you know, continue to leave them in there and test them out, of course, you know, and see, you know, if it is indeed they're, you know, in good shape, then I would go ahead and leave them in there. You can see this one's got a little bit of wear on it. You know, the breech has got wear. There's paint inside the block. So this is going to get a nice full deep clean where we're going to make sure that we get everything because I feel like, you know, that this should be brought back to, you know, its former glory. Angel made some really nice, vibrant blues. I'm a sucker for them. You know, so we, you know, we try to take care of the blue ones. This one's got some marks on it and stuff like that. It'd be a really good shooter, you know, out in the woods or, you know, even, you know, speedball. It could be used as long as, you know your limits. We took the ball detent out. I like to make sure that that it's still working, that it's still got a good spring to it. It can be dirty. We can clean that up. That's not a problem. But if it doesn't have any spring to it, or if the spring is missing, sometimes the spring can get damaged and it can fall out through here. Sometimes the ball might be missing because it's literally just been, you know, beat on. You know, this one can be cleaned up, and, you know, I'm sure that that it will, you know, it'll be fine for another couple of years. So now we've kind of gotten to that point where we're going to be looking at, you know, pulling some internals out. Essentially, I like to take the, you know, I like to take the battery out. I like to, you know, kind of inspect that, get an idea of whether I'm going to need to put a new one in it. You know, recently I've been running into a whole lot of exploded batteries. This one's got, you can see the inside of this is discolored. That is from the battery corrosion, which battery corrosion will eat anodizing. I've seen some really, really bad ones, including 2 Planet Eclipse, splashes that are phenomenal that have been ruined because of leaking batteries. So if you're going to store your gun for a long time, you're going to want to make sure that you pull the battery out of it, and that you can have it sitting with the gun at, wrap it up or something like that, put it in a bag. But if you're going to be doing long-term storage, like this guy's had this gun for 10 years sitting in a garage, that would entail or it would qualify for long-term storage, in which case I would have removed the battery, just because I would have been nervous every time it got hot, every time it got cold, that the battery was going to let go and ruin my gun. Back in the day, these guns were not cheap. I remember just recently seeing ads in the, in magazines people have been finding where some of these guns are, $12, $13, $14, $1,500. So, if you bought it brand new, probably going to want to keep it in good shape. You want to be able to take care of it. All things that, unfortunately, some of these guns just don't get anymore. So what we're going to do now is I like to, typically I like to take the solenoid, and this one's got an IntelliFeed, which is really cool. And I like to take those out. It looks like there's been a bunch of different soldering going on with this one, because I'm seeing a lot of tape. In fact, I'm seeing tangles. I am seeing a bunch of stuff, just like all of this stuff is taped together. Okay, here you go. This is a couple of solders right there. So those were probably at one point damaged. Easy enough, believe it or not. They could have been shut when the when the back plate is put on. Those wires could have been right there, and they put it on here. Believe it or not, these edges are sharp enough, just like a guillotine, they can cut those wires. And at that point you're kind of stuck with having to make decisions whether you want to replace the item that got damaged, or whether you want to solder. I know a lot of people that aren't comfortable with soldering, which is no big deal. We do that here. It's not a problem. These wires can get old, they can get brittle, and at that point, if they do get to a point where there is soldering required and you don't feel comfortable doing it, go ahead and send it in. We'll take care of you. All right, and there's that. Now, yeah, see the end of the battery has got some kind of corrosion on it, but it's interesting because it actually still works. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to test that at some point before putting this all back together, and then I will decide whether I'm going to reuse it or not. But now we're at that point where I like to take off the noid cover or solenoid cover, and then kind of get a good look at the solenoid gasket, and decide if it's in good shape, if it can be reused. Again, I've noticed that there are parts that can be reused. There are gaskets that can be reused. They're not always bad just because they're old. Ones that I tend to replace are ones that are saturated in oil, or that have compression to them, where the solenoid has been sitting on them so long that they actually lose their ability to seal. They are literally more like a plastic piece in between two metal pieces, and at that point, it should probably be swapped out because it's really not doing its job. And one thing I will point out, these screws came out, and they came out okay. They had a lot of paint and stuff like that inside them, but they were torqued down. Again, you know, no need to. This doesn't seal anything. All it does is it literally just sits on top of, you know, the solenoid. There is a hold down, you know, screw here, in which you go ahead and you loosen that up, and that plate will come right out. The one thing I do want to point out is if you have the ram tool, you can also use it as the plate alignment, in which case you just go like this. You can turn it, you can align it, and then you can tighten it by putting the Allen key right in the middle, and the two prongs will go right into the plate. And I'm only saying this because when you notice there's really not a whole lot of room down here. Everything's kind of tight. The IR3 has panels that are on the side here that hold, you know, little grids. And so that makes even less room, you know, so you want to make sure that, you know, that you have all of kind of like the tricks and all of, you know, the additional tools at your disposal. Will make it far easier when taking these guys apart. So now we've gotten to that point where, you know, we get to take all the little things that are added to these guns. This one's got the, you know, IntelliFeed, which is really cool. It hooks onto your hopper if you're running a Revolution, or if you've wired it to another hopper, even better, in which every time you take a shot, the hopper turns on, feeds a ball. Super cool, you know, and Angel came up with it, you know, way before anybody else did, because they just wanted to make sure that you had enough, you know, enough technology to keep the fun going. And, you know, if you're going to be running out of paint, or if you've got your gun cranked right up and you're just shooting just awesome strings of paint, you want to make sure that that continues. And that's where the IntelliFeed came into play. And essentially, you don't have to do anything else with this. You know, you don't have to take anything else off of it. It is, you know, it's dirty. I'm going to clean it. But typically, when you're working on your own gun, it's probably not going to be this dirty. You probably, you know, at one point have done this already, or have at least wiped down stuff. And, you know, this is an extreme case. So now I'm going to take my ram tool. I'm going to go ahead and put the two prongs in the back, and we're going to back this out. I can already tell that the O-rings are shot on this. I'm sure they're probably nice and flat. We're probably going to get some varnish from old grease paint, because this thing is sticky. All right. Yep, there's a lot of oil, a lot of grit. This ram actually looks like it might be failing. I'm going to grab one of my other ones just because I want to compare it and see. And I'm going to show you what I mean. Okay. Now this is another one. It has no hammer on it. And if you look at it really closely, this is the one thing. There's a brass end that's crimped here, and it's flush. This one is not. This one's actually being pushed out, which tells me this crimp in the body has failed. Sooner or later, the reciprocating mass of this ram will push this completely out. And if you're lucky, you'll catch it, and there won't be any damage to the valve, you know, valve train. But if you're not lucky, this could push out completely, which allows the hammer to slam into the valve doing more damage at some point. So I'll be talking with the owner of it, and you can see this brass front has started to come right out. And if you look at this, you can see this is stepped where it's crimped, and you can see this one, it is not. The crimp has actually been completely removed, in which we're, that's going to be a fail. That ram has definitely got failure written all over it, and that's unfortunate, because honestly I think that might be the second or third IR3 ram that I've seen with that kind of fail. I've seen some before where I've had to take them apart and replace internal O-ring, but I've never seen them where, or can't say never, but I rarely see them where that has been an issue. So now we're going to go ahead, all the pins have been removed, we did that earlier. I always like to keep a couple of the towels around, just mainly because of this. You just go ahead and kind of push that internal, the LPR out, push the valve out, and now the body is empty, essentially. It does still have this little black plug in the solenoid housing. That's not a problem. That pops right out. If you're going to be doing an anodizing job or whatnot, you're going to want to go ahead and remove that. In which case you can just, you can just push that right out and have it ricochet all over the place. Good times. So there's that. The body essentially is empty. We're going to do the breech pins in a second, but I want to point out a couple of things here. When looking at like your LPR, you want to make sure that your shims aren't folded or bent over. You want to also make sure that they're in properly. Always grab a manual. They're online, and they're easily readily available. Grab a manual, read up, see what you have physically in front of you, get familiar with it. Look at your pressures, look at your the way that the shims are, because if you pull this out someday and you're like, oh no, and you don't know how they go back on. I've seen people that have been like, oh well, they must just stack together like that, because that would be kind of neat if they did that. And then they put this, and then they put that, and then they put them back in. And as you can see, there's no tension there. They're just going to kind of flop around. Pressures are going to be all over the place. You're not going to have velocity, and that's going to be an issue. And then people are going to hit up the internet and ask them, hey, I just was working on my Angel and now it doesn't work. Can you guys help me out? And that'll be, that's pretty common. Valve, just make sure that there's no damage. Like I was saying before, when the ram tends to fail, what happens is the hammer will work itself further than it should. And I've seen the lips of valves when rams have gone bad and the hammer slammed into them. I've seen the lips of these crack, and at that point, it still works, it still does its job and everything like that. But sooner or later, a piece might break off, might drop down in. This thing will just have a field day, just pinballing it around, beating up the inside of your gun. Again, this is all stuff that's avoidable with regular routine maintenance. All right, now let's get right to the pins. These are always fun. I've had some people that say that they've given up on them because they're literally can be a nightmare. I've had people tell me they've soaked them for days in in penetrating oil and stuff like that. They've heated them up. They've put them in their freezer. They just can't get them out. I've been lucky so far. I haven't had any really bad disasters. But again, there's set screws that hold the pins in place. You're going to want to go ahead, clean out the the area using a pick tool or something like that. I had to clean out this. It had a bunch of had a bunch of grit, a bunch of dirt, paint, just to be able to get the Allen key the Allen wrench in there. And after that, you just back it out. Again, make sure you kind of contain this, kind of keep it so, maybe close to your workstation, because that'll happen. And then this little guy will take off like he has legs, and you'll never find it again. I'm just going to go ahead and take off both because I have the tool right here. Back them both out. There we go. All right. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to locate a screw, machine screw. It's going to be 1.5 millimeter. They're really small. They're really fine threaded, but the breech rods are threaded, and that's going to help you be able to extract them. You go ahead and you just screw them in to a certain point that you feel is enough. You want to make sure that they do actually screw into the breech rod enough, because if you only put them in like 1 or 2 threads and you go to start pulling on these things, and you rip out some of the threads, trust me, it's happened. At that point, you're going to have less and less and less to actually be able to grab onto. Now, what's going to happen next is an actual miracle, in which this pin is a gun that's been sitting for 10 years. The breech pin shouldn't come out that easy. That is just, I should go play the lottery. That's awesome. But here it is. The pin, it's got a little bit of corrosion on it. Not corrosion, but a little bit of surface. You can clean that up with a Dremel and a wire wheel. You can clean that up, with a polishing compound. Make sure when you go to put these back in, you put a little bit of grease on them. Awesome. Be in really good shape at that point. Again, go ahead and thread this on in. Let's see if the front one's probably going to be the one that's going to have me cursing. Yep. Yeah, that one's in there pretty good. In which case, sometimes, see, if I'm moving it, and you can see it is locked right into the breech, because the pin's moving also. So what we're going to do at that point is I'm going to, we're done with the video essentially. You don't need to see me struggling with this. It is going to, be a good time. I'm almost sure of it. But I will, have it, it'll be, pulled out, and taken care of. One thing I will do, if I need to, is I'll put some penetrating oil right here, put some down in here, let it sit overnight, and then I should be able to work it out. But one thing that you can do is you can always kind of do this right here. You can kind of open it up, because this breech area is stiff, which is good. But right now it's not, because I want it to be loose. I want it to, be able to take this pin out. But essentially, that is going to be one of those things where I'm going to, take care of it after I'm done with the video. But there you go. It's a full teardown. Everything is here. The one thing I will come back to is the gasket. You can see this one's kind of bent up. It's got a lot of compression. It is kind of oily and greasy. Got some grit to it. It will get replaced. And that's one thing that you want to pay attention to the details. With that, just because it's little things. Especially like when you go to put it back together, make sure that your holes line up, because if they don't, you will go ahead and you will put your solenoid back in, and it will make a puffing noise and it won't shoot. And essentially it's because if you look here, all of the holes line up. But if I was to take it and I was to flip it like so, let me see here, see if I can get it. Yeah, here we go. I line up the holes, I get ready, I go to put it on there. Well, the center one is open, but these two are not. these two will be completely plugged. Solenoid won't work. It's all the little things that'll get you. Again, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate it. And check out my other videos for other tips and tricks on how to take care of these wonderful guns. You know, and again, I say wonderful guns because I absolutely love Angel. I think they were, you know, far ahead of their, you know, the game. You know, I mean, these things ruled the field for years and years and years. And I still have that feeling every time I get one in the mail. I feel like I'm doing, you know, a great service, you know, for the community and for the person that sends them in, because I just cannot wait for them to take that gun out onto the field and just blow people's minds with it. Again, thank you very much for tuning in, and I hope that you, you know, this has been helpful.